Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to Holes, chapters 36 through 40. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in the burlap sack in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack. Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said. I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign, then headed out. It was the hottest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck and wished he'd at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach as he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but it was now destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he, too, felt the effects. He looked at the big thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked him. Just give me a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then using the shovel, pulled himself back to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign, and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at Big Thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked and wait maybe 10 minutes before looking at it again to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realized that they'd still have to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was once a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit sitting in the boat while her boyfriend rowed. Now, all of this, is pretty funny because Mary Lou is the donkey. Zero used the shovel as a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I gotta stop and rest, he said after a while. Stanley looked at Big Thumb. It didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. And Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade. Then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head to the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think that he might need to dig a grave, Zero's last hole. And who will dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero did get up, once again, flashing thumbs up. Give me some words, he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds to realize what he meant. Then he smiled and said, R-uh-n. Zero sounded it out himself. R-un. Run. Good. F-uh-n. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on besides his pain and weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked up at Big Thumb, it really did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted, yet as bad as he felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. It was possible, he thought, he hoped, that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria were only in the jars which opened easily, the ones he was now carrying in his sack. What scared Stanley the most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than what he felt now. In fact, Maybe at the moment of his death, he would be too weak to feel the pain. Death would be a relief. What worried him the most was the thought of his parents, not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone out to look for Zero, but no one cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she would tell them and when. "What do you think's up there?" Zero asked. Stanley looked at the top of Big Thumb. "Oh, probably an Italian restaurant," he said. Zero managed to laugh. "I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer," said Stanley. "I want an ice cream sundae," said Zero, "with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge." The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up toward it. They came to the edge of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shore where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they had been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had to somehow climb up out of it. They could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliffs also blocked out the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. "I'm all right," he whispered. Stanley saw a rut about a foot wide and 6 inches deep running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. "Let's try there," he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb, straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times, he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up, on a fairly wide ledge. Zero came up alongside him. "You okay?" Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs up sign. Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. "Give me a boost," said Zero. "Then I'll pull you up with the shovel." "You won't be able to pull me up," said Stanley. "Yes, I will," said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped onto his interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero up high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. So protruding is something like that's sticking out. You're using that to grab onto. Stanley continued to help him from below as Zero pulled himself onto the ledge. While Zero was getting himself situated up there, Stanley's attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed hold of the sack and then the shovel. He set the shovel so that half of the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung down toward Stanley. "Okay," he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was one thing for him to lift Zero, who was half his weight. It was quite another thing for Zero to try and pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed up the rock wall, using the sides of the rut to help support him. His hands moved one over the other up the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hand clasp his wrist. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength and for a brief second seemed to defy gravity as he took a quick step up the wall and, with Zero's help, pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took a moment to realize it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both hands. He had held on to the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Zero brought his hands to his mouth and sucked up his blood. One of the glass jars had broken in the sack. They decided to save the pieces. They might need to make a knife or something. They rested briefly and then continued on up. It was fairly easy climb the rest of the way. When they reached flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a fiery ball balancing on the top of Big Thumb. God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. Chapter 37. We're almost there, said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now that they were really almost there, it scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If there was no water, no refuge, then they'd have nothing, not even hope. So a refuge is an area where you might have safety or shelter, so that they're looking for that area to be helpful and save them. There was no exact place where the flat land stopped and the mountain began. The ground got steeper and steeper, and then there was no doubt that they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. It became too steep to go straight up. Instead, they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed directions. So in this case, the height of something in relationship, we talked about this in geography, like the altitude, the highness of a mountain or an area that has raised land. When you're in a plane, you go up by a certain altitude. Increasing their altitude by small increments every time they changed directions. Patches of weeds dotted the mountainside. They walked from one patch to another, using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, and they had to be careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid that they would never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. Besides, he knew they didn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began appearing above the weed patches. A swarm of gnats, those little tiny pesky bugs, hovered around them, attracted by their sweat. Neither Stanley nor Zero had the strength to try and swat them. How are you doing? Stanley asked. Zero pointed thumbs up. Then he said, if a gnat lands on me, it will knock me over. Stanley gave him some more words. B-u-g-s, he spelled. Zero concentrated hard, then said, Boogs? Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's sick but weary face as well. Bugs, he said. Good, said Stanley. Remember, it's a short U if there's no E at the end. Okay? Here's a hard one. How about l-ch? Suddenly, Zero made a horrible wrenching noise as he doubled over and grabbed his stomach. His frail body shook violently, and he threw up, emptying his stomach of the sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths. Then he straightened up and continued going. The swarm of gnats stayed behind, preferring the contents of Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boys' faces. Stanley didn't give him any more words, thinking that he needed to save his strength. But about 10 or 15 minutes later, Zero said, lunch. As they climbed higher, the patches of weeds grew thicker, and they had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any weeds on the lake. Weeds and bugs, he said. There's got to be water around here somewhere. We must be getting close. A wide clown-like smile spread across Zero's face. He flashed the thumbs up sign and then fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. "Come on, Zero," he urged. "We're getting close. Come on, Hector. Weeds and bugs. Weeds and boogs." Stanley looked at him. "I've already ordered your hot fudge sundae," he said. "They're making it right now." Zero said nothing. Chapter 38. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearms and pulled him upright. Then he stooped down and let Zero fall over his right shoulder. He stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He left the shovel and the sack of jars behind as he continued up the mountain. Zero's legs dangled in front of him. Stanley couldn't see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated on one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought only about each step and not the impossible task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came from somewhere deep inside himself, and also seemed to come from the outside as well. After focusing on Big Thumb for so long, it was as if the rock had absorbed his energy and now acted like a kind of giant magnet pulling him towards it. After a while, he became aware of a foul odor. At first he thought it came from Zero, but it seemed to be in the air, hanging heavy all around him. He also noticed that the ground wasn't as steep anymore. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precipice rose up ahead of him. Now, a precipice is almost like a cliff, right? So like a large piece, very steep area, and he could see like an edge to that. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precipice rose up ahead of him, just barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to grow bigger with each step he took. It no longer resembled a thumb, and he knew he'd never be able to climb it. Around him, the smell became stronger. It was the bitter smell of despair. So when you have despair, you're basically hopeless. You've kind of just given up. So complete loss or absence of hope. Even if he could somehow climb Big Thumb, he knew he wouldn't find water. How could there be water at the top of a giant rock? The weeds and bugs survived only by an occasional rainstorm, like the one he had seen from camp. Still, he continued toward it. If nothing else, he wanted to at last reach the thumb. He never made it. His feet slipped out from under him. Zero's head knocked against the back of his shoulder as he fell and tumbled into a small, muddy gully. Now, a gully, think of it kind of like an area that's kind of formed by water. So it's kind of formed and molded out. Think about when you make a sandcastle, how the water can push and make tunnels in areas. So a little ravine formed by action of water, and they can make those channels, kind of like how the Grand Canyon is made. So a groove made by water. As he lay face down in the muddy ditch, he didn't know if he'd ever get up again. He didn't know if he'd even try. He had come all this way just to... You need water to make mud. He crawled along the gully in the direction that seemed the muddiest. The ground became gloppier. The mud splashed up as he slapped the ground. Using both hands, he dug a hole in the soggy soil. It was too dark to see, but he thought he could feel a tiny pool of water at the bottom of his hole. He stuck his head in the hole and licked the dirt. He dug deeper, and as he did so, more water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, first with his fingers and then with his tongue. He dug until he had a hole that was about as deep as his arm was long. There was enough water for him to scoop out with his hands and drop on Zero's face. Zero's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked out between his lips, searching out droplets. Stanley dragged Zero closer to the hole. He dug, then scooped some more water and let it pour out of his hands into Zero's mouth. As he continued to widen the hole, his hand came across a smooth, round object. It was too smooth and too round to be a rock. He wiped the dirt off it and realized it was an onion. I want you to think about who that was important to and how that ties in. He bit into it without peeling it. The hot, bitter juice burst into his mouth. He could feel it all the way up into his eyes, and when he swallowed, he felt its warmth move down his throat and into his stomach. He only ate half. He gave the other half to Zero. "Here, eat this." "What is it?" Zero whispered. "Hot fudge sundae." Chapter 39. Stanley awoke in a meadow, looking up at the giant rock tower. It was layered and streaked with different shades of red, burnt orange, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay a while just looking at it. He didn't have the strength to get up. It felt like the insides of his mouth and throat were coated with sand. And no wonder. When he rolled over, he saw the water hole. It was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide. At the bottom lay no more than 2 inches of very brown water. His hands and fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped some dirty water into his mouth and then swished it around, trying to filter it with his teeth. Zero moaned. Stanley started to say something to him, but no words came out of his mouth, and he had to try again. How you doing?" It hurt to talk. "Not good," Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over, raised himself to his knees, and crawled to the water hole. He lowered his head into it and lapped up some water. Then he jerked back, clutched his knees to his chest, and rolled to his side. His body shook violently. Stanley thought about going back down the mountain to look for the shovel so he could make the water hole deeper. Maybe that would give him cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But he didn't think he had the strength to go down, let alone make it back up again. And he didn't know where to look. He struggled to his feet. He was in a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way around Big Thumb. He took a deep breath and then walked the last 50 yards to the giant precipice, that's the cliff, and touched it. "Tag, you're it." Then he walked back to Zero and the water hole. On the way, he picked one of the flowers. It actually wasn't one big flower, he discovered, but instead each flower was really a cluster of tiny little flowers that had formed a round ball. He brought it to his mouth, but had to spit it out. He could see part of the trail he had made the night before, and when he carried Zero up the mountain, if he was going to head back down and look for the shovel, he realized he should do it soon while the trail was fresh. But he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid Zero might die while he was gone. Zero was still lying doubled over on his side. "I've got to tell you something," he said with a groan. "Don't talk," said Zero. Said Stanley. "Save your strength." "No, listen," Zero insisted. Then he closed his eyes as his face twisted with pain. "I'm listening," Stanley whispered. I took your shoes," Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were on his feet. "That's all right," he said. "Just rest now." It's all my fault," said Zero. "It's nobody's fault," said Stanley. "I didn't know," Zero said. "That's okay," Stanley said. "Just rest." Zero closed his eyes, but then again he said, "I didn't know about the shoes." "What shoes?" "From the shelter. It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend, to understand. Clyde Livingston's shoes? I'm sorry, said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Zero's confession seemed to bring him some relief. The muscles in his face relaxed, and as he drifted off to sleep, Stanley softly sang him the song that had been in his family for generations. If only the woodpecker sighs, bark on the tree was just a little bit softer. While the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, he cries to the moon, if only, if only. I should think about when you've heard that song and what it means. Chapter 40. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it had come to be there. He ate it gratefully. But now as he sat gazing at Big Thumb and the meadow full of flowers, he couldn't help but wonder about it. If there was one wild onion, there could be more. He intertwined his fingers and tried to rub out the pain. Then he bent down and dug up another flower, this time pulling up the entire plant, including the root. Onions! Fresh, hot, sweet onions! Sam called as Mary Lou pulled her cart down the main street. 8 cents a dozen. It was a beautiful spring morning. The sky was painted pale blue and pink, the same color as the lake and the peach trees along its shore. Mrs. Gladys Tennyson was wearing just her nightgown and robe as she came running down the street after Sam. Mrs. Tennyson was normally a very proper woman who never went out in public without dressing up in fine clothes and a hat, so it was quite surprising to the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. "Sam!" she shouted. "Whoa, Mary Lou," said Sam, stopping his mule and cart. "Good morning, Mrs. Tennyson," he said. "How's little Becca doing?" Gladys Tennyson was all smiles. "I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke about an hour ago, thanks to you." "I'm sure the good Lord and Doc Hawthorne deserve most of the credit." "Oh, the good Lord, yes," agreed Mrs. Tennyson, "but not Dr. Hawthorne. That quack wanted to put leeches on her stomach. Leeches, my word." Now, leeches are kind of like the idea of like these little worms that would kind of suck your blood, and it would be thought of medically to take the bad germs out. But, however, it was very dangerous, actually. He said they would suck out the bad blood. Now, you tell me, how would a leech know good blood from bad blood? "I wouldn't know," said Sam. "It was your onion tonic." A tonic is like a word for like a mixture, like a concoction or like a syrup you would drink, said Mrs. Tennyson. "That's what saved her." Other townspeople made their way to the cart. "Good morning, Gladys," said Hattie Parker. "Don't you look lovely this morning?" Several people snickered. "Good morning, Hattie," Mrs. Tennyson replied. "Does your husband know that you're parading about in your bedclothes?" Hattie asked. There were more snickers, more laughter. "My husband knows exactly where I am and how I am dressed, thank you," said Mrs. Tennyson. "We've both been up all night and half the morning with Rebecca. She almost died from stomach sickness. It seems she ate some bad meat." Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher, but had provided the meat in the town. "It made my husband and me get sick as well," said Mrs. Tennyson, "but it nearly killed Becca. What with her being so young, Sam saved her life." "It wasn't me," said Sam. "It was the onions." "I'm glad Becca's all right," Hattie said contritely. "I keep telling Jim he needs to wash his knives," said Mr. Pike, who owned the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself and then turned and quickly walked away. "Tell Becca that when she feels up to it to come by to our store for a piece of candy," said Mr. Pike. "Thank you, I'll do that." Before returning home, Mrs. Tennyson bought a dozen onions from Sam. She gave him a dime and told him to keep the change. I don't take charity, Sam told her, but if you want to buy a few extra onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she'd appreciate it. All right then, said Mrs. Tennyson. Give me my change in onions. Sam gave Mrs. Tennyson an additional 3 onions, and she fed him one at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Now I want you to think about that story, why it was placed where it was, as we go back to the other storyline with Stanley and Zero and how he's feeling. Stanley and Zero slept off and on for the next 2 days, ate onions, all they wanted, and splashed dirty water into their mouths. In the late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade. Stanley tried to make the hole deeper, but he really needed the shovel. His efforts just seemed to stir up the mud and make the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak, but the sleep and the onions seemed to be doing him some good. Stanley was no longer afraid that he would die soon. Still, he didn't want to go for the shovel while Zero was asleep. He didn't want him to wake up and think that he'd been deserted and left there. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. I think I'll go look for the shovel, Stanley said. I'll wait here, Zero said feebly, as if he had no other choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and the onions had done him a lot of good as well. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail he had made 2 days earlier. There were a few places where he wasn't sure he was going the right way, but just took a little bit of searching before he found the trail again. He went quite a ways down the mountain, but still couldn't find the shovel. He looked back up towards the top of the mountain. He must have walked right past it, he thought. There was no way he could have carried Zero all the way up from here. Still, he headed downward just in case. He had come to a bare spot between 2 large patches of weeds and sat down to rest. Now he had definitely gone too far, he decided. He was tired out from walking down the hill. It would have been impossible to have carried Zero up the hill from here, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must be buried in some weeds. Before starting back up, he took one last look around in all directions. He saw a large indentation in the weeds a little further down the mountain. It didn't seem likely that the shovel could be there, but he had already come this far. There, lying in some tall weeds, he found the shovel and the sack of jars. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and the sack might have rolled down the hill, but none of the jars were broken, except the one which has been broken earlier. And if they had rolled down the hill, it was doubtful that he would have found the sack and the shovel side by side. On his way back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit down and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb. Thank you, boys and girls, for listening. I will see you soon.